There is a man whose name still echoes in the corridors of history like distant thunder, carrying with it the promise of glory and the omen of ruin. Napoleon Bonaparte was not merely a general, nor simply a tyrant. He was both, intertwined so intimately that separating the genius from the despot is like trying to tear the shadow from the light. The question that haunts generations remains suspended in the air like cannon smoke. Who really was this man who transformed Europe into his bloody chessboard? The French Revolution had left France in tatters, a political corpse still warm, seething with ideals of liberty and stained with guillotined blood. From the ashes of this upheaval arose a short Corsican, with a penetrating gaze and boundless ambition. Napoleon did not come to power through royal lineage or inherited fortune, but by riding upon chaos, promising order where there was only disorder. His talent for war was undeniable, almost supernatural, as if the ancient gods of battle whispered strategies in his ears during sleepless nights. Austerlitz was his masterpiece, a ballet of death choreographed with mathematical precision. Under the weak December sun, he destroyed the combined armies of Austria and Russia with a maneuver so brilliant it seemed impossible. 73,000 of his men faced 90,000 enemies, and when the snow turned red, it was the adversaries who lay destroyed. This was military genius in its purest form, transforming disadvantage into triumph through vision, courage, and an understanding of warfare that few mortals have ever achieved. But his brilliance on the battlefield was accompanied by something more sinister, a shadow that grew proportionally to his victories. Napoleon began to see himself not as a servant of the Republic, but as its indispensable savior, then as its only legitimate master. The transition from first consul to emperor was not accidental. It was calculated, meticulous, shrouded in ceremonies that mixed the sacred with the profane, where he himself placed the crown upon his own head, even dispensing with the Pope's privilege of crowning him. The cult of personality he built around himself was a frighteningly efficient propaganda machine. Paintings depicted him as a demigod crossing the Alps on a prancing white horse, when in reality he had crossed them riding a clumsy mule. Newspapers sang his praises, while any dissenting voice was silenced with brutal efficiency. Freedom of the press, one of the revolution's most precious achievements, was gradually strangled until only the approved echo of his own voice remained reverberating through France. The revolutionary hero was transforming into what the revolution had sworn to destroy. His internal reforms were undeniably impressive. The Napoleonic Code remains a legal foundation in dozens of countries to this day. He reorganized education, stabilized the economy, and created a meritocracy where talent could theoretically triumph over birth. These were the actions of a visionary statesman, an architect of nations, but every brick of his empire was cemented with the blood of soldiers who died by the thousands in foreign lands. Pursuing his grandiose vision of a unified Europe under his boot, the Russian campaign revealed the true nature of his ambition. Insatiable, irrational, 500,000 men marched east, confident in the invincibility of their emperor. The Grande Armada, the most formidable force ever assembled in Europe, advanced like a human tied across fields and forests. But Russia did not fight the way Napoleon expected. It retreated, burned, waited. Winter arrived not as a season, but as a merciless executioner, turning French soldiers into frozen statues along endless roads. Only a pathetic fraction of that mighty force returned to France, walking skeletons with empty eyes that had witnessed frozen hell. Napoleon had sacrificed an entire generation of young Frenchmen on the altar of his own pride. The military genius had become a butcher, sending men to die in wars that served not France, but his insatiable need for validation through conquest. The line between brilliant strategy and megalomaniacal madness had been irreversibly crossed, lost somewhere in the Russian snows along with the frozen bodies of hundreds of thousands. Leipzig was the beginning of the end, a battle so massive it became known as the Battle of the Nations. 500,000 soldiers clashed in an apocalypse of gunpowder and steel, and for the first time, it was Napoleon who retreated in defeat. His allies abandoned him like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Oliver Aube, weary of 2 decades of incessant war, finally united with a single purpose: to destroy the man who had turned the continent into a perpetual killing field. Elba should have been the end, a comfortable exile on a sunny Mediterranean island. But Napoleon was incapable of existing without the roar of cannons and the adulation of crowds. His return to France was a last desperate cry from a power addict. The 100 days that culminated in Waterloo. There, under rain and mud, the myth died definitively. The man who had redrew the map of Europe was finally stopped, not by his own choice, but by the brutal force of reality, imposing itself on unchecked ambition. St. Helena was a perfect prison, a volcanic rock lost in the middle of the South Atlantic, so isolated that escape was impossible. There, the former emperor languished, dictating memoirs that mixed truth and fiction, reconstructing his legacy for posterity. Until the end, he insisted that he had been a liberator, that his wars were defensive, that Europe had not understood his vision. But the hundreds of thousands of dead on the plains of Europe told a different story, a story written in blood and bones. The human cost of his ambitions was statistically terrifying. It is estimated that between 3 and 6 million people died in the Napoleonic Wars. Entire cities were razed. Entire generations of young people were decimated. Economies were destroyed. Families mourned sons who never returned from distant battlefields, whose names they couldn't even pronounce correctly. This was the price of military genius, when coupled with unlimited ambition and contempt for individual human life. Napoleon saw men as numbers in a strategic equation, disposable pieces in his grand game. His influence on the art of modern warfare is undeniable. Military academies still study his campaigns with almost religious reverence. The concepts of concentration of force, rapid mobility, exploitation of interior lines, all of this was refined and perfected by him. Generations of generals have tried to imitate him, from the battlefields of the American Civil War to the steppes of World War II. He revolutionized warfare, making it more lethal, more efficient, more devastating. But is this a contribution for which we should be grateful, or a curse that continues to claim lives to this day? The central question remains impossible to fully resolve. At what point does a savior transform into a tyrant? Napoleon brought stability to France after the Terror, but he established a personal dictatorship. He spread the revolutionary ideals of legal equality throughout Europe. But at the point of bloody debate, he created an empire based on merit, but concentrated all power in his own hands, eliminating any voice that dared to dissent. Genius and tyranny did not exist in him as separate compartments, but were fused into an indivisible alloy. His defenders argue that context matters, that Europe was in constant war, and that Napoleon simply responded to threats against revolutionary France. They point to his lasting reforms, the modernization he brought to underdeveloped countries, and the end of feudalism in regions where it still prevailed. There is truth in this, but it is a partial truth, one that conveniently ignores the rivers of blood, the suppressed freedoms, and the cult of personality that poisoned French politics for generations. The greatness of his achievements does not absolve the horrors of his methods. His critics see him as the prototype of the modern dictators who would come later. The charismatic man who emerges from chaos, promising order, who gradually concentrates power until nothing remains but his will, who sends millions to die in endless wars, fueling megalomaniacal ambitions. Stalin, Hitler, Mao, all studied Napoleon, all learned his lessons on power, propaganda, and the use of military force for political ends. If he was the precursor to these monsters, then his legacy is poisoned at its root, no matter how many legislative achievements can be credited to him. The uncomfortable truth is that Napoleon was both, simultaneously, inseparably. He was capable of strategic brilliance, bordering on the supernatural, and of calculated cruelty that chilled the blood. He could reorganize the legal system of an entire continent while censoring newspapers and imprisoning He elevated ordinary men to positions of power based on merit, while placing incompetent members of his own family on thrones throughout Europe. He was essentially human on an amplified scale, with all the contradictions, hypocrisies, and capacities for good and evil that this implies. In the end, perhaps the question has been incorrectly formulated from the start. It's not about choosing between military genius or ruthless dictator, but about recognizing that he was both, and that this tells us something profoundly disturbing about the nature of power and historical greatness. Napoleon Bonaparte was forged by the chaos of his time, but he also amplified and perpetuated it, leaving Europe exhausted and bloodied. He was a product of history and also its author, sculpting the future with decisions that cost millions of lives. The question that remains echoing through the centuries like the distant shot of a cannon at Waterloo is not who Napoleon was, but what he reveals about ourselves. To what extent are we willing to forgive the monster because of the greatness of the genius? And when we look at the great men of history with admiration, are we celebrating achievements or simply bowing once again? Before brute power,